So,
Hello.
hello.
Good morning.
Good
Okay,
morning.
let's do some announcements. Year of Learning, sponsored by Lilia Boris Kagan, to remember you sign up for the mother, his father, Yisuf Ben Mato. So tomorrow's a Chodesh Lunch and Learn. At this time, reservations are closed, but you can always catch us on Zoom. Okay, so here.
Okay, we're set?
Yeah.
Okay, good morning, everybody. Good morning, Yoshua.
Good morning.
Before I talk about stealing and borrowing, I have to give an introduction. One of the things we do here from time to time is to burst certain myths that people commonly believe. And this is a classic one. King Ptolemy II, who ruled after Alexander the Great, and he ruled mostly the area around Egypt. And he was known to have a great library in Alexandria, where he translated all the great works of literature and philosophy into Arabic from whatever language, of Greek and so forth. And he also wanted to translate the Torah, which was a great piece of literature, to add to his library, or to translate it into Greek, which was a language that was spoken throughout most of the world at that time, after Alexander. And the Gemara tells us, and it's quoted in Shulchan Aruch actually, that the saddest day in the Jewish calendar is when they translated Tanakh into Greek, because you can't translate Chumash and Navi literally, because there are perushim. You have to, each word is not always taken literally, and it's the saddest day in the calendar because people from that point on began using the translation, and it very often was inaccurate. And what he did was he gathered the Sanhedrin, 72 members of the Sanhedrin, and he put them in the island of Pharos, which is an island in the Nile, in a hotel, and everyone in their own private room, and they were each asked to make the translation. And the miracle was that everybody made the changes the same way, so that there was no contradiction, and because you can't translate literally. No. What's significance of that introduction? You have the Ten Commandments written on the ceiling of the shul. It's very famous, and one of the basics of the so-called Judeo-Christian tradition: thou shalt not steal. Right? Thou shalt not kill. All the other commandments, thou shalt not steal. The only problem with thou shalt not steal is that's not what the words mean. And this is the most common misconception. That's what I want to burst that idea. Lo signov. If you look at Rashi on the spot, what does Rashi say? Right on the spot, he says, talking about kidnapping. You can't steal a person. That's what it means. It doesn't mean, because lo signovu later on in Chumash refers to actual stealing of items that belong to somebody else, taking something that doesn't belong to you. And there's a difference, by the way, between a ganef and a gazlan. A ganef is somebody who comes into your house and steals something. A gazlan is a guy who holds up a gun and says, "Give me your money or your wife." You know, that's that old joke. But a guy who holds you up, that's the guy. That's the gazlan, as opposed to the ganef who steals. Imba machteres, you might say a ganef, and so forth. So the notion of stealing is not based on the Ten Commandments. I just want to make that clear. Lo signov, and the Gemara has a very clear discussion about this. The Gemara in Sanhedrin, it says, Tana Rabbanan lo signov begonev nefoshos hakosav medaber. It's very clear. It's talking about kidnapping. And he says, and he relates it to the fact that thou shalt not kill. You're talking about nefoshos. This too is also nefoshos. And Rashi on the spot says, begonev nefoshos hakosav medaber. So it's very clear. That's number one. But so putting aside the source, for stealing. That's not the Ten Commandments. It's another pasuk in Torah. It's still an important principle of halacha, of all law, that you don't take something that doesn't belong to you. Okay, that's very clear. If you take something with the intention of restoring it or paying it back or borrowing it or returning it, is it permissible to take something if you're going to bring it back? It doesn't belong to you. Can you borrow something without permission? Is that considered an adjunct of stealing or not? I'll come to that. Collison's film. That's a classic example. It's interesting that there, even though we say lo tignov refers to kidnapping, there is a discussion on this. If an eved, well, I'll come back to that later. The Talmud Yerushalmi refers to the stealing. He learns it from a different source. The asafta de goncha, the siroshka v'yitzorech. When you gather stuff in your field, when you gather your crops, not somebody else's crops, that's where he derives not stealing. Okay. So the Gemara tells us that stealing applies even if you plan to return it or pay back double what it's worth if you use it in some way. There's a prohibition in general of taking something that doesn't belong to you. And this is called shoel shalom midas. You're borrowing something without somebody's knowledge or permission. Does that make you a goner for a gazla? And there are legal discussions about, the consequences of borrowing it. The Talmud Yerushalmi tells a fascinating story. Two rabbis were walking along, Shimon ben Kahana and Rabbi Lazar, who was an old man at the time. And Rabbi Lazar asked Rav Shimon, take a splinter off that fence. I need a toothpick. Take a splinter off the fence. And then he said, no, I changed my mind. Because if everybody takes a splinter off the fence, the one splinter by itself is no big deal. But if everybody takes a splinter, there's no more fence left. So again, you're taking something that doesn't, it's a tiny little thing. But the concept is what's prohibited. You can't even steal as a person, as a joke, or with the intent of paying back double its value. Again, some before should say it's a midas chasidus, but clearly it's more than a midas chasidus. The Shulchan Aruch paskins that you can't even steal as a practical joke, which causes sometimes people get out of hand on Simchas Torah, and they take things that don't belong to them. They'll steal the shoes of the Kohanim during Berchas Kohanim as a joke, but that's stealing. I mean, again, it may be funny, but the point is, for the people who need their shoes, it's not very funny. So there is a category, interesting category in halachic thinking, that there is an assumption that people don't mind if you borrow something to do a mitzvah. If you want to share the merit of a mitzvah, and somebody, for example, and we do this in shul very often, somebody comes to shul and forgot their talis, and somebody from the early minyan left his talis and fell on the bench, so you pick up somebody's talis and you put it back. Why is that permissible? Because of the concept that we assume that a person wouldn't mind if you're using his talis for the purpose of the mitzvah. You're not going to, assuming you're not going to rip it or stain it or anything. And what's very, very important, the Rosh makes a brilliant observation, and I see this all the time. We have shul talesim on the front bench. And a lot of time, people who are young boys or someone who's not married picks up a talis to get an aliyah or for Hag Galila. The Rush says very clearly, you must fold it afterwards when you put back something that's not yours. And very often they just dump it down. It's wrong. If you borrow something that's not yours, put it back in the way that you fold it up, put it back nicely. And it's unfortunate that the Rush had to actually specify that. Otherwise, there's no presumed consent because you don't want your talis to be just lying there. And the same thing would apply to tefillin. The assumption is that you don't mind if somebody performs a mitzvah with something that belongs to you, but you have to put it back in the way that you found it.
Excuse me, you said put it back the way you found it.
Yeah.
So the talesim that are up there for single men or whatever.
Right.
If they're just sort of draped over a bench or a seat,
Yeah.
can they just return it draped over?
No, they shouldn't, because it shouldn't be just draped over the bench.
I don't know what's
Yeah,
going on.
it should be folded. It should be folded. It should be folded. Okay. There's also some halakha discussion. Is there presumed consent if an object is very fragile? If something could be damaged? And again, borrowing without permission is only if it's not going to affect the item that's being borrowed. So you can't do anything that might diminish its value or somehow destroy it. Here's a fascinating case, and this is practical. And the Rosh talks about this. Ruvain takes a loan from Shimon, and Shimon gives him books as collateral. And then a third person, and then the lender gives the books to a third person to read, to learn, whatever. And with the instructions to return it to the borrower when the loan is paid. However, when the loan was repaid, the books were in pretty bad shape. Either some pages were ripped, or it was dirty, or the binding got torn. And the Rosh Paskin, that Levi had no right to use the books as a third party, and he has to pay for the damage. Because if you're borrowing something, and you're taking it as something as a collateral, you don't have the right to give that collateral to somebody else to use. So that's, again, another case. I had a neighbor, Rabbi Blitzstein, brilliant guy, and he had a big library. And I once asked to borrow one of the books that I saw there. He says, I don't lend books out. You want to read it in my house? Be my guest. Stay here as long as you want, but I don't lend books out. Because very often it's happened to me. I've lent books to people, never got them back. And I remember in one case which still sticks in my mind because the book is irreplaceable. There was a well-known rabbi who was in my house for some reason, I forget why, and he saw a book on my bookcase, and he didn't ask. He said, "I'm borrowing this." He never returned it, and it's a rare book, not available anymore. And he has since passed away. I haven't asked his son for it, but it's gone. But anyway, yeah.
It doesn't have to do with important svarim, but when I went to Camp Ramah in Pennsylvania, I was the only one in I don't know if boys do it, but girls like share clothes, borrow, this kind of thing. I was the only one in my club that would not lend out any clothes. And people looked at me like I was a jerk. And I said, look, the reason I don't is because if something happens to it, either by accident or something, I'll feel bad, you'll feel bad. So it's better off if I just don't.
Okay, but that's perfectly understandable. And of course, that's the exception to the rule. Because girls, they share all the time. I know when they go to Israel and you have a couple of girls in a room, and if each girl brings 3 dresses, and that means there are 9 dresses to circulate, or 10, or whatever. So yeah, I'll tell you, guys don't share clothes, but very often they might swap kippot, which is problematic because of lice and other issues. But I remember you talk about camp. This was 1964, 65. A few years ago. There was a young lady that I was friendly with, nothing more than that. Somebody I had met a year before, and she crocheted a beautiful kippah for me. It was a black kippah with turquoise design, very, very pretty. And I had a stack of kippot in my cubby, which I would rotate. And one Shabbos in camp, there was a guy there who came for a visit, just for Shabbos. And after he left, my kippah was gone. So I looked at all Shabbos, all summer long. I was standing in the back of Shiur, looking at people's heads. Who took my, because it's open. The cubbies are open. You don't have locks on it. Now, see who stole my kippah. Turns out that this young lady went to Israel, and the fellow who had visited that Shabbos was on the same tour that she was on, and she spots the yarmulke. So I wrote the guy a letter, and I say, it seems that my yarmulke went to Israel without me. And P.S. I got it back. But that's a fascinating story.
That girl must have been shocked to see her yarmulke.
I don't know if she asked him, where'd you get that? But she wrote me about it, and I wrote back to this guy, and I said, hey. Okay, so we talked about borrowing. Again, normally, cheftze mitzvah, you can borrow. That's okay. However, let's move this now to a different setting. Can a teacher confiscate something from a student with the intention of ultimately returning it at some point? Is that considered stealing or not?
Well, if it sets a rule in the class that excludes something, he's going to take it. I mean, the question is, does he have to do that or not?
All right, so again, if you take something away to prevent disruption, to prevent something going on in the classroom, it might be legitimate. What's the source for all of this? If you recall, when Yaakov left Lavan, Rachel took the trophim, the idols of Lavan. She stole it, borrowed it, whatever you want to call it. 2 possible interpretations: either because Lavan was an Oved of Avodah Zarah, maybe it's possible that Rachel may also have wanted the idols. A more charitable interpretation is that she took the idols so that Lavan wouldn't worship them. She could have destroyed them, but she took them. Again, there are some Mefarshim who point out that one of the reasons that she was punished later on, she died, was because she stole something from her father, even though her intention might have been good. If stealing will teach a lesson, or taking something, for example, or even physically disciplining a child, which the halacha seems to allow, you shouldn't discipline a student in a harsh way. Obviously, harsh corporal punishment is not allowed. Taking something that doesn't belong to you is still a question mark. I mean, teachers confiscate things from students all the time. Question is whether it's appropriate halachically to do that. If it prevents further disruption in the class, and if your intention is to give it back to the student or back to the parent, perhaps, you might find ways to legitimate taking this away. There's a fascinating letter from Ovadia Yosef, the former chief rabbi of Israel. Encyclopedic knowledge of halacha is amazing. In 1969, his son, Rav David Yosef, who's now a prominent rabbi on his own, he was 12 years old. And maybe he was a bit of a discipline problem in class, I'm not sure, but his teacher fined him a lira. And if he wouldn't bring in a lira, but no, a quarter or whatever it may have been, he couldn't come to class the next day. He was fined for his misbehavior. So Rav Yosef writes the following letter to this Rebbe. And he says, my son told me that he's hired knas of a lira. And he was told that if he doesn't bring in the lira, he can't come back to class. I'm sending you the lira. Even though I didn't get any notice from you about it, I just heard from my son. But I want to know, on what basis did you fine him this lira? Is there any clear halacha? What did he do that was so terrible, number one? But what is the basis? It says, and my son proclaims his innocence. They didn't do anything wrong, because every kid says that. And his friends will back him up, which happens all the time. However, even, put that aside. I don't know if this is proper educational practice to instill fear in students for their misbehavior. I also, where is it? What did you hope to accomplish? And what is your source for doing this? Here's the lira. I want my kid to go to school. So, and at that time, he was the chief rabbi of Tel Aviv when he wrote this letter to the teacher. So clearly, we know from experience that teachers will confiscate things from students that are disruptive. If you give them back, hopefully, that it doesn't become a problem. Which is, how long do you hold something? So confiscating things, punishing kids, it's all in that same category of or subcategory of perhaps of stealing. You're taking something that doesn't belong to you, even though you might have a justification for doing so, but one has to be very, very careful when you're dealing with mitzvos doraisa, isurim doraisa. You have to think twice before you do something. Again, for a dvar mitzvah, it's permissible. Want to borrow someone's talis or tefillin, that's fine. Yeah.
Can you take a toy away from the child, or his grandparents gave him a gift?
For what purpose?
He wasn't behaving.
Again, it depends who's taking it away. If it's a parent, it's one thing. That parent can certainly do that. Whether a teacher in a school can take something from a student that doesn't belong to him is up in the air. It's not 100% clear that a teacher has that right. Again, if the child is so disruptive and that toy or object is causing a problem, then you can temporarily take it if it's going to allow the class to learn. Because there are other halachos of Talmud Torah where if a student is being disruptive, you have to sometimes they ask him to eat, or you can take him out of the class, perhaps. And there's a famous tshuva, Rav Moshe was asked about a kid who was really a wild kid, and they wanted to kick him out of yeshiva. Are you allowed to expel a student from yeshiva? Big, serious question. And Menahalim wrestle with this every single day. And Rav Moshe said, if he was preventing other students from learning, unfortunately, maybe you can. And, because there are other things that are more important. But be aware that these are all halakhic considerations that of which people have to be aware as a teacher, as a parent. Again, today, with very rare exceptions, teachers do not use corporal punishment to discipline children anymore. In the Sephardic yeshivas, I remember many, many years ago, one very prominent Sephardic yeshiva in Brooklyn, the parents tell the teacher, smack my kid around if he misbehaves. Perfectly okay, it's acceptable. Hasidic yeshivas all the time. It's acceptable. It's acceptable. Today, you don't, today you'd probably get thrown into jail. I can tell you, again, things change. When I was a principal, if a kid used inappropriate language, I took him into the bathroom, I gave him a toothbrush, I put some soap on it, not even toothpaste, and brush it out of your mouth. I did that.
I mean, I heard that when I was little. It never happened to me because I was always called the goody two shoes, but,
Today, I would guess,
did that.
today a parent would sue me and throw me in jail if I did that. But the kid never spoke inappropriately again.
To you.
Not to me, anyway.
About
About me, for sure. But, actually, I saw that particular kid in shul a couple of weeks ago.
Oh, my gosh.
He was here. I hadn't seen him for
Does
decades.
he walk around with toothbrushes?
But, at least he still comes to shul. That's important.
When I was in school in Philadelphia, a math teacher, who's I'm sure long gone, had a very clear rule: no chewing gum in Mrs. Shatner's class. And she told us from day one, if you are caught chewing gum, you have to give me a nickel. It goes to the Jean Shatner vacation fund. And she tackled it. I mean, no one knows if she ever accumulated enough to go anywhere. But she laid out the rules, and they were very clear. No one had any question about it. And there were some people who still tried to chew gum, even though they saw her collect the nickel here, nickel there.
My French teacher in high school, Monsieur Clément, had a miniature guillotine in class,
Oh, you bet.
and he would chop carrots with it. And he said, if I ever catch anybody cheating on a test, your fingers will go in here.
Oh,
I mean, it never happened.
but it's a terrible concept.
I'm an old person. This is many years ago. Today, it wouldn't happen. But it was effective. It was
I had a
effective.
third grade teacher, and she would have been put in jail in 5 seconds for what she did to Shaman.
Anyway, so just to summarize, the takeaway, number one, is that thou shalt not steal is an inaccurate translation of one of the 10 commandments. It's thou shalt not kidnap. And stealing is a totally different pasuk and other sources altogether. And again, shoel shalomi das, borrowing something, if it's a chayfetz shel mitzvah, the assumption is that you want people to do mitzvahs with your objects. So they can borrow a talus or a pair of tefillin, and assuming they put it back in the same condition in which they took it, which according to the Rush means you fold up the talus and put it back. Other than that, if you borrow something from somebody else, you have to ask permission for it. You can't just take it. And certainly if you borrow it and you do damage to it, you have to, of course, pay for it. As far as teachers are concerned, taking things from students, obviously you have to return them, but you can only take it if that's the only way to deal with a certain level of disruption in the classroom. Otherwise, it's a form of theft because it doesn't belong to you. Even though the child might be disruptive, you can temporarily borrow it from him and give it back to his parents at some later date. Okay, that's what I wanted to share with you this morning. Anything else? Good. Have a great day.
Okay, thank you. Okay.
Thank you, Wally. Hi.
Thank you. You have a great day too.
Yes, let me just shut off the record.